welcome to Post-Exertional Mayonnaise podcast. We're joined today by Litsa Dremousis, and it's brilliant to have you with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before I introduce you, can I just ask a question? Because I keep meaning to ask people this, and I always keep forgetting. Do you like mayonnaise?
Yes, I do.
Oh, that's all right then. It's a bit of a
Oh, go on. I'm sorry.
no, it's a bit of a random question, but because we called the podcast that, I thought I'd start and ask people because I don't know, some people don't like it. So
I'm one of those people who splits the difference and uses low-fat mayonnaise because it still has flavor. But yeah, I do love mayonnaise.
Good idea, yeah. So yeah, Litsa's a author. She wrote Altitude Sickness with Future Tense Books publishers, and Seattle Metropolitan Magazine named it one of the all-time 20 books every Seattleite must read. Her essay After the Fire was selected as one of the most notable essays 2011 by Best American Essays, and the Seattle Weekly named her one of 50 women who rock Seattle. She is an essayist with the Washington Post. Her work appears in The Believer, Black Book, Esquire, Jezebel, McSweeney's, Monkey Bicycle, MSN, New York Magazine, and many others. She has interviewed Dan Auerbach of the Black Keys, Betty Davis, the legendary reclusive soul singer, Death Cab for Cutie, Estelle, Jennifer Lewis, Janelle Monáe, Alanis Morissette, Kelly Rowland, and more. So yeah, would you describe yourself as an author, an essayist, a writer? You kind of cover a lot of different kind of bases, don't you?
I do. I haven't published much fiction lately. I have published fiction short stories in the past. I describe myself as author, essayist, and activist. Because it sums it all up, and it's alliterative. So win-win.
Yeah, that's good. And I would say that Litsa lives with ME, and you've had to deal with cancer recently and a heart attack. And do you want to sort of tell us briefly your chronic illness story? I would say that if people want to kind of learn a bit more, Litsa was recently on Millions Missing podcast, did a piece on there, and that's kind of what I listened to, and I thought it'd be brilliant to talk to you and learn a bit more. So yeah, go and check that out. I'll put a link in the description as well for that. But yeah, if you'd like to tell us a bit about your ME and chronic illness story, Litsa.
Thank you. I have had ME since 1991. And like many of us, I can pinpoint the day and time when the symptoms first arose. For me, it was Saturday. Excuse me. It was Saturday, August 17th, 1991. I was at Seattle Center with my mom. Seattle Center is this, it was built for the Seattle World's Fair in Seattle in 1962. And it's just this great location of the Space Needle. That's where the Space Needle is. But of great older buildings, and a lot of our, like the Bumbershoot Annual Arts Festival is there. And so it's just a lovely, lovely place. And we were attending a jewelry show. And I was 24 years old, otherwise healthy. And at the time, I was working as a domestic violence victim advocate for the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. So I was working with people who were under siege in their own homes. And I was volunteering at the crisis clinic, and I was writing freelance at night. I worked out each day, had a very full, vibrant life. And I looked at my mom. We're at this jewelry show at Seattle Center, and I said, what? Like the ground felt like it had shook. And Seattle's on a fault line. If anyone's listening to this, that's my dog digging in the background. And I thought perhaps we'd had a small earthquake. And she said, no, what are you talking about? And it still felt like the floor was undulating, and I had never experienced this before. And she suggested, let's get you outside. There was a hot dog stand right outside. She said, let's get you some food and sit. And I didn't feel good after I ate, but I felt better. And again, I'd had strep throat and other things, like I'd had to have my tonsils out, but no indication this would be anything that was going to disrupt permanently the course of my life. So we just sat for a while, and we went back in, and because I was 24 years old, my friends and I were having a party that night. And at this age, I might say, oh, I'm too sick. And at
Mm.
that age, we still had, this huge party. But throughout the entire night, it felt like I had this encroaching, awful flu, and I couldn't figure out how or why. It was August. And from that to September 8th is when I went to the emergency room for the first time. I walked to one end of my hallway and could not walk to the other end. And I called my parents, and my dad has since died, but I'm very close with both parents. And I said, something's wrong. I need to go to the emergency room. And they mobilized immediately because that's so out of character for me. And of course, and I know a number of us have similar experiences to this. In the ER, they were just completely baffled, and all my tests at that point kept coming back normal, which was on paper that was gratifying, but on the other hand, it was really disconcerting because if I'm normal, why can't I walk, and what's happening? And for the next 4 months, I had to move back home with my parents, and I was in a wheelchair for the most part. I could get out of it with help. One of the only good doctors from that time, he was a cardiologist who was slightly older than I was. And he said, I don't know what you have, but I believe that you're sick because no 24-year-old voluntarily moves home with mom and dad. So if nothing else, he understood the paradigm. No one's doing that unless something's wrong. If I hadn't had the good fortune to have parents and a brother who love me, I don't know. There are many times throughout the 33 years, almost 33 years I've had ME, that I don't know, would I still be alive if I hadn't had the help of loved ones? And that's definitely one of them. Some of my friends were also amazing, but I needed help showering. I needed help lifting my head. One of my friends, I threw up all over him. A rheumatologist had given me an experimental drug for lupus. And of course, I don't have lupus. And I just hurled it all over my friend, Dre. Hi, Dre. And it just got worse and worse and worse. And again, as is common for many of us, I slowly improved after the onset. I was sent to physical therapy, which we now know is the worst possible thing. All we were doing was destroying my mitochondria. But it did help restore the awful degeneration of my muscles. My muscles regained some strength again. And so I walked with a cane for a long time. I tried to go back to work part-time for another year or so, and they were allowing me to work from home. And it was just unsustainable. And then my whole division got cut, and the part-time workers in my division got cut anyway, so that made the decision for me. But the extreme nausea, extreme dizziness, as you know, for all of us who experience this, fatigue is such a complete misnomer. The absolute physical inability to lift one's head, to get out of bed without help. I would have wet the bed without my mom helping me get in and out of bed. And she was a practicing deputy prosecuting attorney herself at that point. And well, not herself. We worked in different divisions of the same office, as did my dad. But she took time off from work and was having to help me do every fucking thing. What happens if you don't have a person like that? And like I said, a lot of my friends at that time were very good. I lost some, and I know, again, this is common, I lost some over time because once it became clear I was not going to get well, some of them just bailed. But there are some from that period who are still very much in my life, and I'm grateful and I love them. But I'm guessing we have a shared experience here too. There are many days, even though I know at this point I'm going to wake up feeling unbearably ill. It's not a surprise. I'm emotionally prepared for it, but there's still so many days when it strikes, when I'm awake. I genuinely question, can I get through this day?
Yeah. It's hard, isn't it?
It's all of us know it's almost unbearably difficult, and the horror of it is compounded by a medical system that too often either ignored us or emotionally abused us. And we're starting to finally see the tide turning. We're finally starting to see ramifications from that. And there's 3 great doctors I've had, but 3 in 33 years. So, and then there have been a few who have been okay. But if you look at the hundreds of physicians I've seen, and in my experience, massage therapists, I had 2 really good massage therapists, but I haven't found alternative medicine to be that much more effective. By this point, I've tried pretty much anything viable. And I really want to stress that from the beginning. There have been some very good clinicians across the board, but not nearly enough. Not nearly enough. And more so than anything, I think MDs, and I can't speak to Britain, but I will go ahead and eviscerate the MDs in the United States. When the Centers for Disease Control laid out the diagnostic criteria in 1988, it wasn't comprehensive. It did all of us a huge disservice by putting fatigue right in the name from the start. Because as you know, that's one symptom of about a dozen. And people hear it and say, oh, I'm tired. I worked hard today. And they are tired. Unquestionably, they're tired. They are not experiencing what we are experiencing.
No.
And the only one of the 8 who apologized is Dr. Anthony Kameroff of Harvard, who's by no means really an advocate for persons with ME. But even Dr. Anthony Kameroff was like, wow, we screwed up with this name. Sorry. As we speak, and then I want to let you ask questions, but as we speak,
go ahead.
We speak in the United States right now, our National Institutes of Health is having a week-long conference on ME. And
I've seen clips, yeah,
they're doing amazing work. And the Open Medicine Foundation and ME Action and all sorts of ME advocacy groups are streaming it or posting video. Dr. Maureen Hansen is truly one of our heroes right now. She's a professor of molecular biology at Cornell. And she had a paper come out months ago on why she thinks I'm going to synopsize a lot of it, but why she thinks the likely trigger is going to be the HHV6 virus after all. And she's astoundingly good. And in the start of the paper in question, she writes about the history and why it used to be called chronic fatigue syndrome and why it should not be called chronic fatigue syndrome now. But about 2 hours ago, she said at this conference on ME for the National Institutes of Health, she said a point that I've been making forever, but she has a much bigger audience. She said, we know there is swelling of the brain and the spinal cord. So it is encephalomyelitis. It is time to drop the CFS once and for all. So I've already tweeted my thanks to her. But I think in particular for all of us who lived through the 90s, and I've spoken to people from the 80s and 70s, the emotional abuse at the hands of physicians was just unbearable. And that's why we have an illness with such a high suicide rate. We're ungodly, unfathomably ill, and then we're treated like garbage by the people we're paying to help us. But that was a name that was completely weaponized just against us in the 90s. And I just will not use the hashtag. I will not call it CFS in any context. But I was really thrilled to hear Dr. Maureen Hansen say it today because she is at the forefront of the research, and she's kind of one of the persons who really gives me hope right now.
Yeah, it was. I don't know about in the US, but I had ME kind of when I was younger for sort of 7 years in the 90s, and it was very much called like yuppie flu then. I don't know if that was a term that you've heard before.
God. And
sort
it's
of posh,
cruel.
rich people that don't want to work. The sort of the stigma is just awful, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, and we both know the reason it got tagged yuppie flu is because people with a little, like I had money when this all started. I don't now, but I did then.
Yeah.
We're more likely to have access to healthcare. And because up until extremely recently, we did not have a diagnostic test. And kudos to Oxford on your side of the pond for developing the diagnostic test about 2 months ago. It won't be ready for market for a while, but that is Oxford that kind of finally cracked the code. But up until this test will be on the market, it remains a diagnosis of exclusion. So who has the insurance in the United States? And I know you guys have the NHS, But even so, wealthier people still have access to better health care.
Mm.
So people of means were able to go from doctor to doctor to doctor and have MS ruled out, have lupus ruled out, have myasthenia gravis ruled out, etc. And then you're officially diagnosed with ME. So, of course, it had nothing to do with that we were yuppies and didn't want to work. It had everything to do with we were more likely to have access to readily available healthcare.
Mm.
But yeah, I hate that term. Anytime even people even joke about it, it's like, no, don't.
Yeah, it's just not good. But yeah, and then so you've kind of you sort of like been living this for sort of 30 years, and then you've managed to kind of like build up a sort of a career as a writer. And how is that sort of something you've managed alongside the ME? Because it's hard, isn't it? It's sort of like, I guess some days you've got the brain energy, and other days, I know for me, like sometimes I'll write a blog and then I won't be able to write a blog for months again afterwards because I just haven't got the sort of brain processing. So that must be a real challenge for you.
It is. Thank you for asking. The last year is the first year of my career I have not had new work come out. And this will be the third podcast I've been interviewed on this year. My second ME podcast, and earlier in the year, it's called Another Fucking Writing Podcast, and I was interviewed for that. But this is the first year ever I have not had new work come out. And, well, I've had a piece accepted to an anthology, but it won't come out till next year. And that has been a gut punch. That has been a real gut punch. I'm devoting my time in between this onslaught of doctor appointments. I'm devoting it to finishing the second book. And there have been different iterations of that, both that I've scrapped and that have been rejected. But as I've joked to one of my closest friends, I will get this out if it has to come out posthumously. I do not give a fuck. If I end up dying at the end of it, it was worth it. I think it's the best thing I've written. So we'll see if others conclude the same. But
what's the new book about?
The new book, it's called Fire in the Hole, A Eulogy for the Living. And it is a series of short essays about the onset. It focuses primarily for me with the first 3 years I had ME, but it jumps back and forth to the present day to then, but also weaving in different parts of history that are relevant. What I'm hoping, my fondest hope will be that it is akin to what I'm going for is a contemporary version of Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor. And that's a book that I recommend to everyone who is newly ill, because in addition to being, she was a literary genius, it's only, I think, 107 pages long, so it's not some huge tome. But she underscores the ways in which every generation or so, there is at least one illness that is completely dismissed. And she wrote this in the late 70s, and then she wrote a later version in the 80s. She wrote it when she was diagnosed with cancer for the first time. And she talks about how tuberculosis, people with TB were told they had a tubercular personality until the advent of the microscope. And then it was like, oh, geez, we're sorry. You have a bacterial infection. How with MS, they, of course, were, in the United States at least, there were people who were institutionalized in mental institutions with MS before the advent of the MRI. And we learned, oh, geez, your myelin sheath is disintegrating. Just from my own personal experience, this isn't in her book, but I know women who in the 60s and 70s gave birth to children with Down syndrome, and doctors would blame them. What did you do wrong? I know women who, again, from that same period, have children who grew, as they grew, they developed schizophrenia. And again, the mothers were blamed for it. It's only been this last week in the United States, there was finally a major treatment breakthrough for sickle cell anemia. So Susan Sontag's whole point, because she was writing specifically about cancer, which of course carries a stigma now, but carried so much more in the late 70s. She was writing throughout and I'm not trying to overly synopsize this great literary work, but the points that she was trying to make is too often you have the medical community just dismiss you. They can't figure out what it is. So
Mm.
fuck you, you're making it up. By the way, hello everyone,
Mm.
I swear. And her second point being you also have people during that era who are just kind of frightened. Well, this person
Yeah.
got sick and we don't know what it is. So therefore I'm going to freak out and stay away from them.
Mm.
So my book, Fire in the Hole, A Eulogy for the Living, it focuses specifically on ME, but ties in different parts of history that are relevant, and indeed ties
Mm.
in parts of my own family's history that are relevant.
Brilliant. It must
I
be.
hope. I hope. The first book had such a smooth path to publication, and this one has encountered every roadblock. So,
Wow. Yeah. Should we talk? Should we talk about altitude sickness? I read it in a morning, and it's so well written, and I can see why it's won so many awards, and I just got drawn into it really quickly, and what I found was really, and I don't know whether it was purposeful, but it was I wouldn't say easy to read because it was a really hard topic, and we'll sort of talk about that. But what I found was that it was easy to read for me as somebody with ME who kind of struggles with kind of like really heavy stuff, in the sense that you kind of broke it down into sort of shorter sections, didn't you? And it was kind of you could sort of read a bit and kind of reflect on it, and then read a bit more. And do you want to talk about it and sort of just sort of explain what the book's about, because it's deeply personal, isn't it?
sure. Thank you. The book is about the death and life of my late best friend and on and off again romantic partner. We were on again, off again for over 21 years. And there were periods, long periods, we were just platonic, and other periods we were just dating. But we talked on the phone almost every day, and we were each other's person. And he died mountain climbing. He was supposed to be back at my place on October 6th, and we were going to go to our literary reading together. And we had a whole system in place because he was an inveterate mountain climber and one of the most experienced in the region. But we had a system in place, as he called it, the worry zone. If he wasn't back by a certain time, go ahead and start letting everyone know something's gone wrong. And he had been climbing for so long, he could calibrate when he would be back and at which point I should start to worry. And despite the fact he went on God knows how many climbs around the world, we had never crossed into the worry zone before. And this time we did. And I called one of his friends. He's like, no, he was one of his climbing friends. But the next morning had the Chelan County Sheriff's Office. We had a search and rescue. I, of course, was too ill to participate, but I was overseeing all the communication between friends, family, search and rescue, media. I've always say if he had come home alive, the 4.5 days in which he was missing would remain the worst of my life. And keep in mind the ME, the cancer, the heart attack, we'll get to all of that. When the person you love most in this world is missing, we knew he was in the North Cascades, but we didn't know where. And he was climbing alone, and that was his choice. But his death, more so than anything, completely shattered me. By October 10th in the afternoon, Lieutenant Agnew of the Chelan County Sheriff's Office told me his body had been found. And truly one of the most bizarre acts ever. I was asking details, and she said, this is a matter for the coroner's office now, and literally hung up on me. So I'm finding out he's dead, and then like someone's hanging. Who hangs up on you in that moment?
It was just incredible reading it. Yeah.
Like what? So the book is about. It starts with TJ's memorial. The reason I called him Neil in the book, and I discussed this recently earlier this year with a writing podcast. I think if I had to do it all over again, I would just call him TJ. I was writing it 5 years after he died. And even then, even though I was writing this book that Future Tense Books had asked me to write, I was really moved by the offer. Neil was my nickname for him. He called me Jack, short for Jack Kerouac. And it was actually his idea. And I called him Neil for Neil Cassidy because he used to joke, everyone, this was his joke, that he just kind of bopped around. And because I wrote about him so many times, I'm the one who made him interesting, which he was being wildly self-deprecating, and he was utterly fascinating all on his own. But that's why his name in the book is Neil. One of his family members called our local NPR affiliate after I'd done an interview, and she's like, he never went by Neil. It's like, not with you. But that person has a long-standing history of mental health issues, so that's a whole different topic. But so it's an account of his death, and he always said he felt most alive while he was mountain climbing. And I've been asked this next question repeatedly. Was he in any way suicidal? No, never. And he and I discussed this at length. He never was. I'm the one who experiences suicidal ideations, and that's how the subject would come up. He would have what he would call his winter blahs, so periods of kind of low-grade depression in the winter. The only thing that gives me solace is he fell 1,000 feet and died instantly. We know that with a fall of that magnitude, usually a person's lungs collapse and they lose consciousness before they hit the ground. So there would have been a few seconds in which he knew he was going to die. But we all have loved ones who have died deaths that, they were dying 18 years of cancer or something. I'm used to the fact he's dead. October made 14 years. I still talk to him. I don't know if he can hear. I don't purport to have any of the answers. I should probably insert parenthetically that the book is oftentimes funny. I'm making it sound like a dirge, and the book itself is often, the story itself is not funny. The book in the telling is, and he and I were very funny together. He had a great sense of humor. And if anyone would understand that I have a morbid sense of humor about his joke, it's TJ. But it starts at his memorial, and that is verbatim what my brother said. This memorial 8 balls. And then we work back in time and then back to the present, and I incorporate the research. There's a considerable body of neurological research about the neurobiology of people who engage in extreme sports and what prompts them. Because like I said, TJ was not suicidal. He would always say he felt most alive when he was climbing. What prompts someone to feel most alive when they're a hair's breadth away from death? And going to your point about the shorter chapters, it's because I do have ME. I admire Tolstoy profoundly. I couldn't write like him if you put a gun to my head. Those chapters that are 110 pages, can't do it. So in my case, form follows function. I cannot write a long chapter. And when I wrote, directed, and produced 2 plays in the late 90s when I had a sustained remission, wherein I always felt like I had a mild flu, but I could do much more. And the plays themselves are shorter and the scenes are shorter. I do not have the physical duration to write long, but it seems to resonate with everyone that it's shorter and immodestly that I managed to work in a number of different subjects in a shorter word count. So it sort of works out for everyone.
Yeah, and I think if people are interested in reading something that's not too, I mean, it was just really interesting to read because I kind of learned stuff through it, and it's an interesting topic, and it's deeply sad, but like you say, you sort of do incorporate some humor in it, and it's my cousin climbs, and I was thinking about him while I was kind of reading it. It was interesting, but what was really interesting as well was the kind of the bits towards the end where you talked about the research and for climbers, this kind of like difficult, this sort of balance between the sort of like the dopamine hits and the kind of the almost like an addiction, and for people that climb to get that kind of kick almost, but then is it a choice, or is it? It was interesting because Dov also read the book, and he sort of noted it. Is it a choice, or is it an addiction? And is that a contradiction? And how do you sort of like figure that out for people that are kind of like seeking those kind of thrills in a way?
I think those are incredibly insightful questions.
Mm-hmm.
I never ever speak on TJ's behalf because after 14 years, people
Mm.
evolve and change. I can make an educated guess what I think he would say, but I never ever answer on his behalf. This will be the one exception. If he were here, he would definitely argue it is not an addiction. Because
Mm.
while he was still alive, I never posited that it was an addiction, but I was getting worried about kind of a compulsive aspect to it.
Mm.
And he refuted me at each turn that he didn't find anything compulsive about it, that he really, and I do believe when he said that it brought him this enormous joy in life, and as he said, he was drawn to the grand vistas, that at that elevation, you see things you cannot see at any other elevation or part of the world. And of course, he's correct.
Mm.
And when he died, I think the word I heard most often to describe him was sweet. Everyone said he was really sweet. And I'm 100% Greek. My family's been in the United States forever, but Greek dads are notoriously protective of their daughters. And when TJ and I were younger, my dad could be extremely hard on him. But as we got older, dad really liked him, and my brother really liked him, and my mom did too. But to have gotten the seal of approval from a Greek dad is a
Mm-hmm.
pretty big
Mm-hmm.
deal. And the world always seems a little bit emptier without him, and I think that's true for all of us who've loved someone that deeply and then they're gone. And tragically, that's just part of growing older. We're all going to lose more and more loved ones until it is us. But I'm always grateful that he was here. And
Mm.
that's how without giving away the ending of the book, but it does touch on that. That's what
Mm.
I'm left with. I was a lot angrier in the earlier years because his death was not a suicide, but neither did he get hit by a bus. He played a
Mm.
role in his own death. And that was hard because there's really no place. That's why I joke in the book, there is no support group for this.
Mm.
It's funny how many people didn't get that that was a joke and who asked if I wanted to start a support group. I was like, no, I don't. I don't want to sit around with a bunch of other people who have gone through this because we're all just going to bum each other out. But
Yeah,
I'm going to have to lie flat now because I'm getting really dizzy and weak. So pardon me,
that's fine.
everyone. I think I think our given audience here will understand.
Yeah, we're just
So
all
I'll
about
move it so
being
we get all
ourselves.
4 Beatles in the shot. There we go.
Yeah. Um. Yeah. So that's altitude sickness, and I'd really encourage people to sort of you can get it on Kindle, or you can get hard copies.
Yeah, it's
And
available
yeah.
from the publisher Future Tense Books in Portland, Oregon, here in the States. You can get it on Amazon. Like you said, you can get it in hardcover. You can get it on Kindle. I'm really pleased it's still growing strong 9 years later
Mm.
for a smaller publisher that we've done this, and that it's not Franzen in terms of sales, but it's still going, and that's invigorating.
Mm. So I was gonna ask you as well about your writing around music as well. Is music a big passion for you? Is that something that you've kind
Yes.
of developed, and I wondered if you had some sort of stories from your music writing.
I'm gonna as I answer this, I'm gonna see you can see the Beatles and Nina Simone just right out of the gate. I
Yeah.
have this huge wall collage with a number of my loved ones and a number of my favorite authors and musical artists. Yeah, just like many of us have always been a huge, huge fan. And part of the reason most of my friends in high school, hey dudes, I'm still friends with them, that I was the only girl in the group. I was in high school in the 80s, and
Mm.
there were only a handful of girls who were into music the way I was into music. And there was a lot of kind of looking up at the boys with doe eyes. And I was like, no, I want to go to all the record stores and I want to go to all the shows. And I had very strongly held, informed opinions. And it's funny looking back how much of that was the propulsion for how these friendships developed, how I ended up in a crew of mostly guys. And like I said, I'm still friends with most of them to this day, which is pretty great. Um, so I've always loved the Beatles, and the Stone. For me, my formative bands were the Beatles, the Stones, the Kinks, and the Who. And then it grew into Aretha Franklin, Janis Joplin, Marvin Gaye, and just I was enamored of that whole era. And then REM came along, and for the first
Mm.
time, there was a band that my friends and I all just fell in love with, and they were 10 years older than us, but they were our band
Mm.
because obviously all the name groups I just named the first time around, they were from the 60s. And when I
Mm.
was in high school in the 80s, it was Styx, REO Speedwagon, Journey. And I know a lot of people love Journey. Well, I'll have to agree to disagree. But just bands that I could not get with at all. It's like, what? And every dude you met at that age had to tell you about Rush. And I was like, and I know a lot of people love Rush. I get that they're musical geniuses. They just do nothing for me. But REM came along, and it's funny. I've had this conversation with 3 different friends recently, how transformative that was for a number, like the art geek, Gen X, literary, music nerds. REM was who we fully embraced. In the 90s in Seattle was also a pretty spectacular time because obviously you had Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in
Mm.
Chains, Pearl Jam, and then Sky Cries Mary and other bands that didn't quite break through at the same, you know, just worldwide stratosphere. I was too sick to go to any of those shows. I got sick in 91.
Mm.
And like an idiot, I spent 1990 in law school. So
Mm.
when I might have been, when there's this huge change, this permanent artistic blossoming slash revolution in Seattle, despite having majored in creative writing in college and getting a straight 4.0, so the equivalent of a straight A throughout the entire program, I was editor of my high school paper. The one time I'm trying to, see, okay, can I live life as an attorney, as an upstanding citizen with a more dependable paycheck? I missed the burgeoning Seattle scene because I was in law school. And then after Nirvana was on Saturday Night Live, and then there was just every media outlet in the world was camped out in Seattle for the next 3 years. I was in a wheelchair. So I was still listening to them. But in the
Yeah.
beginning, I don't know, was your onset like this too? In the beginning, I couldn't listen to music at all. It was just, now I have to listen to it on low. I can no longer attend shows. I haven't been able to attend a show since I saw Elvis Costello in 2015. But the first 2 years I had ME, music was too much. The sensory overlay, it hurt. It physically hurt.
Yeah. I go through
And then
phases. It's funny. I'll listen to lots of music, and then I won't listen to music for a while because it's just, yeah, like you say, too much.
it and again, I think that's another symptom. It's hard, and we know why that's occurring on a neurological level, but it's hard for someone who hasn't experienced it to understand,
Mm.
because it's such a joy. Even if not all of us
Mm.
have the same musical taste, music almost universally brings joy and a sense of belonging, and allows you to feel tethered to something bigger. So I'm really proud that Seattle created all of these bands and nurtured them. I wish I had played some active role in it.
Mm.
I fell into music writing by accident. I interviewed someone for The Believer, which is one of Dave Eggers' publications, and it went very well. And then Paste asked me to write the first cover story on Death Cab for Cutie, and that was in 2005.
Wow.
And I had been in the wheelchair again in 2001. But by 2004, 2005, I could either go with a cane to shows. Because again, when I was back in the wheelchair, there was a good 2 years, 3 years, completely incapable of attending music in any realm. And again, had to listen to things on low or not at all. And then when Paste asked me to write the cover story for Death Cab, It's like, yeah, I hadn't written a cover story before. It was 5,000 words. And that damn nearly did me in physically. That was one of the
Mm.
hardest. The writing itself wasn't that difficult, but the length of it made it. I was just so I was so ungodly ill after I turned it in, and I had been in a better period at that time anyway, or I couldn't have written it. Oh, and the kicker was over the weekend, and this was when it was online, but print was still much more of a force than it is now. The editor in chief calls me to let me know that they've upped the print run by 200,000. So we have to get this
Wow.
just right. And as if I wasn't already feeling like I was on the verge of throwing up, I just remember this knot in my stomach during the phone call. I was like, I hadn't written a cover story before. So, like, okay, don't screw this up. It went well. It went well. And then I got asked to write more and more music stories. And for a long time, I interviewed musicians for Esquire, New York Magazine, MSN Music. Interviewing Betty Davis for Esquire remains one of my all-time. It was one of the most poignant interviews.
Mm.
For those who don't know, she was light years ahead of her time. She was a soul singer in the late 60s and early 70s. She was one of the first Black models to appear in American fashion magazines. She was married to Miles Davis. Sometimes people only know her through that connection. But she sang about sex in a really frank, honest way, and just had this amazing rhythmic propulsion and had a fantastic band. But she was wearing these sky high, I don't know if you've ever seen the photo of her in these sky high silver lame platform boots and a mini skirt, and she just looks like a queen. Well, this was when an era where, and I'm very much a feminist, so not critiquing the sisterhood here, just putting forth the history. It was in a period in feminism where the prevailing ethos was to get away from mini skirts and makeup and everything. So you had a bunch
Mm.
of second wave feminists walking around in drindle skirts, and Betty Davis is just full blown glory with false eyelashes and as she told me in this interview with Esquire, and this was 2007, I believe, not fitting in anywhere. She was getting blowback from feminism. She was getting blowback from the NAACP. They didn't think she was presenting African Americans in a positive light. Now she's
Right.
embraced every soul singer, a whole lot of hip hop artists. She's
Mm.
considered one of those who was just so far ahead of her time. She fit in nowhere,
Mm.
but is now completely embraced. And she died, I want to say 2 years ago. Google, all of you, you can just look that one up. But if you have not listened to her music, highly recommend. Light in the Attic
Mm.
reissued 4 of her albums. They're masterpieces, the first two in particular. And she
Mm.
was very shy and reserved, and kind of felt the industry had just used her up and spit her out, and it had. But that
Mm.
was one of the most gratifying interviews. I genuinely felt honored to speak with her.
Mm. Wow, fascinating. That's interesting. Yeah. So yeah, I think from anything that I miss, apart from like working and things like that, but I really miss live music, and I sort of I'm sort of like generation later than you, I guess, and I sort of grew up on like U2 and Britpop and things like that, and
All of which I love.
I
Yeah.
got to go. I got to go and I saw U2 once at Twickenham Stadium in London in the summer of 2017. So it was about 5-6 months before I got ill, and I'm just like really glad I got to do it. It was like one of their sort of huge events kind of thing, and they did the Joshua Tree album. It was like they were kind of going back to that again, and yeah, it was just brilliant, and it's one of those sort of like memories that you think I'm so glad I did that because like then I became ill. Like didn't know I was going to become ill. Like sort of a few months later, and yeah, there's certain sort of times, and yeah, it just really like even if I was kind of doing better, I think I'd struggle like in a live music venue because I think it's just this sort of sensory overload. So it's like even if I
Yes.
could like walk into the venue and sit down, it would just be like I wouldn't last for very long, and that's the frustration, isn't it, with ME, that you can't access, like, it's not with disability, you could talk about wheelchair access and all those sort of stuff, but it's the actual ability just to even be in that environment for very long before it kind of hits you, and it's hard.
And the lack of predictability most of
Yeah.
the time. I mean, for all of us, how many years have you been sick now? So 6?
Since 2018 this time, but I had it for 7
Okay.
years as an adolescent as well, so I had like a 20-year break from it, and then it hit me again, so yeah.
Oh God, I'm so sorry, Daniel.
Yeah.
But the reason I was asking, we know there's we're able to predict somewhat our level of strength, not consistently. But at this point, you have a sense, okay, whether to even buy tickets for the show.
Yeah.
And going to your exact point, if a crash hits during a show, it's physiological impossible to even get out of there.
Yeah.
And you have that nightmare, because it only happened to me once, but you have that nightmare scenario where you're crashing and it's hard to see, it's hard to hear, you can't balance, you have no strength, and you've got 18,000 people around you, and somehow you've got to get from where you are to the car and somehow get home. So it feels like you're playing Russian roulette.
And even if you can go, it's like, what's going to be after effects in terms of the post-exertional stuff as well. So it's, when's it going to
I
hit you
should make
afterwards,
that
and is it
clear.
worth it?
When I was interviewing musicians, I wasn't always able to go to shows. And indeed, for some acts like Kelly Rowland, Alanis Morissette, those were all on the phone. Billy Corgan, who I don't know if I got him on a good day. I don't, because I'd heard everyone who'd interviewed Billy Corgan had warned me, and we got along famously, and he was in a very good mood. So I don't know if I was a statistical anomaly or not, but many of them were doing national press, and they were doing phone interviews anyway. So I wasn't required, like Sam Beam for Iron and Wine, I wasn't required to attend a show. I miss being able to go to live music. And without a treatment or a cure, Elvis Costello in 2015 at Seattle's Paramount Theater will be my last. And I think that was the 12th time I'd seen Elvis. He's one of my all-time favorites. And I was very sick, and going to your point, I don't think I moved at all for about a week after. I was very dizzy and very nauseous, but it was Elvis. And in terms of cost benefit analysis, I figured, yeah, it's worth it. But now I've degenerated to the point it's not a decision. I've got 2 good hours a day, and by the time I even got to the show, half of that time would be used. And then, like you so astutely noted, the sensory overload that accompanies music of that volume. One of my very good friends, I would say his name, but he's a privacy dude. But he had suggested getting state-of-the-art headphones, and maybe that would allow me to attend shows. And I explained to him, I said, no, when the music is of that volume, there's just really no way for my body to process it anymore. If I could, I would. But no, it's, and that, I mean, we all know far bigger heartbreaks than that, but when you love something that much, it's hard to give it up.
Yeah. And just, like, for me, it's just like being in the middle of a crowd of people, like, energized me in the past. Do you know what I mean? Or especially the sort of gigs where you're standing and you kind of like, there's a real atmosphere there, and but yeah, it's that's definitely one of the things that I find hardest. It's but like you say, it's I guess it's finding ways to kind of like appreciate music when you can as well, in different ways. Yeah. So
right now, for me, it's listening to it on the days that I can listen to it, listening to music on low online, and that's I'll do it until I cannot, and then when it just feels like, as I describe it, it feels like someone's taking a cheese grater to my brain. When I reach that point, it's like, okay, now I'm just lying quietly in silence with my dog. All of my physical energy is devoted to my dog, Jordan, He's a Pomeranian, and we go for a short walk in the morning, a longer walk in the afternoon, and a shorter walk in the evening. And I'm able to make meals, but even then they're very healthy meals, but they're very simple because 99.9% of my physical energy is devoted to the health and well-being of my dog. And I love him more than I can describe. And I don't know if I could keep going without him. I know the correct
Mm.
answer is friends and family, and that's I love my friends and family profoundly. Um, a number of my friends of late have just been astoundingly kind. My friend Robin took my dog and me and drove us because I haven't been able to drive in 13 years. She took us so we could go look at Christmas lights in a different neighborhood. I just had to go to the emergency room 2 weeks ago. My friend Lynn like camped out with me in the emergency room for 6.5. I was there 8 hours. She was there for 6.5 of them. But a lot of my life, as my friend Chris always says, he says, if he calls me comrade, he says, comrade, if you're out of bed at all, your life is always interesting. And it's true. If I can do anything at all, it's the results. I have a pretty good time. But of late, there have been so many cancer and radiation complications, and then to have had the small heart attack last year, aside from walking the dog, and they're not long walks because he's not a huge dog, he's a little guy, most of my day is in bed. And between the afternoon walk and the evening walk, sometimes I'm watching a movie or reading a book or writing. But as often as not, I am lying flat in the dark with my eyes closed. And even if it's
Mm.
summer, I'll have to draw the blinds or put a towel over my eyes to block out the light because the photosensitivity is so extreme when the other symptoms are so extreme. And again, I know it's hard sometimes for people who have not experienced this to understand what it's like. Do you feel trapped in your own body?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Sometimes, yeah, I try not to dwell on it too much because it gets you down an awful lot, doesn't it? And I think it's just trying to sort of like get through each day, managing as best you can, I suppose. But yeah, we've been doing a grief series recently, and different people have been talking to us about the impact of grief on chronic illness, and one person said a very similar sort of analogy, feeling like a caged tiger. And I think when you've got activist tendencies, maybe like yourself, being like a caged tiger is quite a good description. And yeah, some days I might feel like that, and other days I don't. So I think it very much depends from day to day. But yeah, being trapped in your own body is, yeah, I like that analogy. Analogy, yes, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I
Mm,
end up feeling like that
yeah.
most of the time, that
Mm,
I'm just desperately looking for an exit, not in an existential way that I want to die, but can I get out
mm,
of this body? Because I feel like the essence, whether we want to say soul or core, whatever, however we want to define it, I feel like that part of me has nothing to do with this illness and is trapped in a
mm,
body that has been hijacked.
mm,
But I don't
yeah.
mean that in a way to bum you out.
No, no, no. It's I think we've all, and I think by talking about these things and finding analogies, useful analogies, I think it helps because, and I think it's one people have commented on listening to the podcast that it's been really helpful that actually we're talking about things that people can relate to, and particularly with ME and chronic illness, it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think, and there's so many other things that we could get onto. I'm just aware of the time, so we'll probably finish soon because we'll probably wearing each other out. But I think there's so many things that are unique to the experience of like energy limiting conditions, and that that I think is difficult to kind of put into context unless you really understand it. And hopefully by doing these sort of podcasts, that it's hopefully people maybe without ME, or that are interested but kind of like want to learn more, are listening. But for me it feels, what I feel like maybe trying to do is just affirm for other people, what we're going through, and that actually there's others out there that are going through this, and that it's it's very real, and we could have gotten to. I had on the list to talk about sort of medical trauma and gaslighting and things like that, because I know that's something you've talked
Can
about.
you go another 5 to 10? I can.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I don't
That
want
might
to
be
max you
something.
out. I'm lying down, so
Yeah, all right.
ask me what you want to ask.
No, because I know that on the Millions Missing, that was something that you touched on in terms of the and I guess we've talked about it a little bit in terms of the history of ME, and the name of and everything that's come with that in terms of um, the stigma that's come with it, and I think maybe it'd be good to just sort of finish off talking about some of the activism stuff. And you've written about ME as well, haven't you? And I think that's
I have
really
extensively.
powerful to have somebody in your position that is has been able to do that and actually put across a really real picture of the illness, and like you say, not just focusing on the fatigue, but this is like a whole myriad of symptoms that come with the condition that makes ME extremely disabling. And yeah, like, thanks for doing that. Do you feel you've got like a responsibility, or do you feel like a pressure to write about ME and chronic illness, or do you feel it's part of who you are, so it comes naturally?
The latter. For me, it feels like it's part of who I am, and it does come naturally.
Mm,
And even from the beginning, I mean, there's still, as we both know, this cataclysmic stigma that accompanies this illness through no fault of the people who have it. But I've been out from day one. And in the early 90s, it was, like saying you had three heads. But I knew from the beginning something is attacking my body. And I got sick at 24. By the age of 26, I was asking my doctors, what is this going to do to my life expectancy? And of course, at that
mm,
time, even the doctors who knew something real was occurring physiologically, they told me not to worry about it, that by the time you're old enough to worry about it, we will have a treatment or a cure. And
mm,
I hope, I'm being charitable here, I hope their intent was good, and that perhaps it was hard to look a 26-year-old in the eye and say, we don't know. Um, I was not surprised at all when decades later research corroborated that, of course, ME can be potentially fatal. And indeed, as you know, in the UK, you guys started adding it as a potential cause of death on death certificates in 2012.
mm,
I I always felt that whatever had happened to my body was going to shorten my life expectancy. And the Open Medicine Foundation in the United States is the collaborative research team of Stanford, Harvard, and now the Mayo Clinic. And
mm,
they say they're going for a cure, and God willing, they discover one. Uh, Without one, I don't. I'm just going to speak for myself. I don't think my story ends well at all. I don't know if anyone heard that my
mm.
dog just growled. Hey, buddy.
I didn't hear that.
That my dog growled at that exact moment. Um, Hi, Jordan. it it feels like I'm dying. I very much believe when, to be clear, this next study was not conducted by Yale, but Yale found it solid enough that they added it to one of their ME features on Yale Med School's website. This was a few months ago. That the average life expectancy of a person with ME is 55.9,
Mm,
and well, I'll be 57 in February. In recent years, my thyroid cancer was misdiagnosed. The physician in question at Polyclinic Madison in Seattle told me for 2 years she dismissed every symptom as menopause, which of course is what happens when you're a woman over 50. Just, it's menopause. It might not be.
mm,
And by the time it was discovered in the ER, it was stage 3. And the only reason it was discovered is I had to go to the ER twice in 36 hours. And I refused to go home the second time. I said, something is really wrong and you're missing it. The radiation treatment has made me unfathomably ill. And if I could go back in time and say, no, don't give me radiation, I would do that because it didn't get rid of the cancer. I still have cancer, and the radiation caused my salivary glands to rupture, just a laundry list of other symptoms. And then last year, I had a small heart attack. And I would like to underscore for everyone with ME, if you don't already know this, people with ME have higher rates of cancer. We have higher rates of heart complications. Wealth of research. The NCBI section in the United States of the NIH has, you can just scroll through, you can Google it and you can find everything. So explaining to my doctors, these are not unconnected, because I had just this team of MDs looking at me baffled, like, whoa, you've got ME and we don't know anything about that. You've got stage 3 cancer. Now you've had a heart attack. And me basically drawing a graph, like, kids, work with me here. These are all connected. Not everyone has ME to the same degree. Not everyone has the same symptoms. But I very much believe this is killing me. And I recently told my cancer doctor last month, and subsequently fired her, because when I told her this is killing me, and I'm not saying that for a fact, this is unsustainable. I don't know how much longer I can live this way. But regardless of my tenacity, this is killing me. And she looked me in the eye and said, I believe you, but this is not in my wheelhouse. And she said, I don't have the time to read about ME. And we know ME also disrupts the endocrine system. So ME is very much in her purview as a thyroid cancer specialist, and she did nothing. So I fired her. But that's at the University of Washington, which is supposed to be one of the United States' best clinics, and it's here where I live in Seattle. Well, the new cancer doctor had someone from patient relations call me. This was just earlier this week. And he's agreeing to be my cancer doctor with the caveat that I refuse to discuss ME. And I told the person from patient relations, I said, okay, but that means we're going to have a lot of medically inaccurate doctor appointments. And I said, I don't understand, when you know I'm taking notes, why you're telling me this over the phone. So where I draw hope is no one credible can refute that ME is real, disabling, degenerative, and potentially fatal. And our Centers for Disease Control just announced last week, so 6 days ago, that vastly more Americans have ME than they previously thought. They're now putting the minimum at 3.35 million, which, no shit, anyone who studies ME knew. And it's actually going to be much, much higher than that. But it's impossible for any clinician, even though they keep doing it. And I keep having to send in the research, and then I send in my own ME work that I wrote about for the Washington Post. I can see her fading. We'll get going.
Yeah.
So just to end this with a more hopeful note, there is an enormous amount of research online accessible for free. I am of a temperament, it's not hard for me to send it to my physicians and say, you need to read this. What's wearing me down is this arrogance that they bring to the table, that if they don't know it, it's not happening. And to me, it's not only arrogant, it's dangerous, and it's anti-intellectual. But for anyone who's newer to this illness, it's not like it was in the 90s where we had a very limited body of research. There's an enormous amount of research out there now. Cornell, Yale, Stanford, Harvard, Oxford. Like I said, Oxford has developed the diagnostic test. So there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful, despite the fact we all feel, I think, like we're trapped in this maze in hell.
Yeah. And I think it's good to hear that, because I think sometimes it feels like nothing's moving on, and I really appreciate people that, can disseminate the science and kind of grasp it and move things on, and it's good to hear that, and it really is, because it does give us a little bit of hope, even though I think the biggest challenge is the fact that the science is there, the research is there, but it feels like it doesn't filter down to the doctors who kind of need to access it somehow. They're not aware, or they don't read, or, like you say, they're not interested, and that's the big frustration, isn't it? That there needs to be a sort of like a cultural change or a cultural shift within the medical profession to actually kind of listen and take on board. So like I'm really interested in what would be brilliant is to kind of maybe speak to you again when you do get your book published, and to hear a bit more about that and read and I'd love to read Fire in the Hole, because I think that'll be an important bit of work, and I think it'll be really interesting to read that. So I think that'll be brilliant to speak into that a bit more.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for being here. I've really enjoyed it, and hearing your stories and your experiences, and thanks for everything you do for the ME community as well. It's good, and I really appreciate it. So.
Right back to you. Take care. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.